I think so too, yeah. I'll just hit it.
Do you want the stand or should I just put it
I
on?
don't think we need the stand. We're going to trade off. So thanks. Okay. All right, we'll try again. Hi, everyone. I think we'll get started because church ran a little bit late and we have a lot to share. And we'd like to have time for questions at the end, and we'll see if that happens. We're also going to have another session on immigration next week, same time, same place. So if we don't get time for good discussion today, please come back next week and we'll have more opportunity for that. So I'm Jane Runsheimer, and I'm part of a group of people who traveled to Las Cruces, New Mexico, and El Paso, Texas this January to learn about kind of the immigration situation at our U.S. southern border. And our group is here, and we're excited to share our journey with you today. We're all going to share kind of a part of our trip. Our group consisted of mostly Bethel members, so Mark and Marie, and then Kitty, my mom, Kirsten, Scott, and then Mari and Bo, Aylin, and Fletcher. And then we had Jean and Darlene Broughton. And then we were honored to be joined by Barb Alstetter from UCC, a good friend, and also another friend of ours, Pastor Katie Bardseth from Madison, Wisconsin. And we all shared a passion for kind of learning about what's happening at the border, and also for finding ways to help migrants, both at the border and here in Northfield. Our host organization was Border Servant Corps, and they're based in Las Cruces, New Mexico. Border Servant Corps is a partner organization with the Southeast Synod of the ELCA in Minnesota. And as you can see, it was started in 1997 at a very small church, Peace Lutheran Church in Las Cruces. And members of this church began sheltering migrants in the church as they came across the border, giving them food, clothing, medical care, and help with transportation to their sponsors in the United States. And basically, this little church had an incredible 24-hour ministry. People stayed there overnight. They staffed it overnight. And as the number of migrants increased greatly, the little church welcome center grew into this much larger organization, which is called Border Servant Corps. And basically, there's three main missions. The first thing is their hospitality center, which was in their church, grew and they purchased an armory, and now it's a large shelter that's connected with U.S. Border and Customs Protection. So they actually receive buses of migrants who present at the port of entry in El Paso every day, migrants who are seeking asylum. And depending on the day, it can be 20 to 30 people, or it can be over 200 people arriving at their door. So it's an incredible ministry. They also have a lot of community support and volunteering going on for people in Las Cruces, a lot of partnerships with organizations there. And then another big part of their mission is what we got to participate in, which is they host groups from all over the United States, churches, colleges. Jesse got to go from Denver as a part of Urban Servant Corps. And we stay kind of in accompaniment style immersion. We stay in a home called the Janan House, which is connected kind of to the organization. We eat together, and then we get to learn a lot of things. We heard from immigrants who shared their stories. We heard from the amazing people who are working in shelters and hospitality. And we met with some government workers like U.S. Border Patrol agents and immigration court officials. So these were our trip leaders. Kathy Chatelaine on the right is from the Southeast Synod. She's the assistant to the bishop and in charge of global health ministries. So she was a kind of our leader from Minnesota. And then our New Mexico leaders were Mika, Marta, and Amanda. Mika in the center heads up the volunteer as coordinator of BSC, and these guys were a lot of fun and really awesome. So those were the people who led us. Okay, so Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you. We're going to kind of take it day by day and share with you kind of our experience. And keep in mind, we're hoping to do another trip next winter. So, if anyone has an interest, let me know and we'll put your name on the list. So,
Thank you, Jane, for that great introduction. So we are, here's the sign at Las Cruces. There's that's the town that we stayed in, and there's a couple slides coming up that'll show about the farmers market we went to kind of introduce us to Las Cruces. This is kind of an aside from the overall focus of the trip, but it's a nice farmers market where there's lots of foods and crafts, and we spent the morning there before we headed in the afternoon to the Border Servant Corps Immigrant Shelter. You can see here that the immigrants arrive on a bus there from where they present at the Las Cruces checkpoint, which is where they present seeking asylum. They come on a bus and there's tents there for them if it's a hot day to stand in, and then they come inside the Border Servant Corps, which is, they're inside there with the checking in, and this is an armory that was purchased by Border Servant Corps. They, when they found out that the needs that they couldn't meet at Peace Lutheran Church, they moved into the armory, which is a big facility and allows to house a lot of immigrants. So when they come into this facility, the goal is to have them on their way in 48 hours. Most of the immigrants come in and have a family member or friend that they're trying to get to stay with. Some of them have a way to get there, a lot of them don't. So they check in, they get this booklet here on the left that kind of tells them what their experience, or what's going to happen at the shelter there. And the biggest thing they try to do is get them a ticket to the place that they're trying to be at, which is places all over the country where their families are. So here is a warehouse, or a storage room where some of the clothing and other needs that they are going to be met are received. They get shoes and clothing and toiletries and things like that, because they basically arrived there with nothing. The other picture there showed some cots where they'll be sleeping at night, right there on the lower right. And then we can move on to the next slide where we see this is a shower facility that was donated by the U.S. government, and it's a beautiful facility with warm water, very clean, and for a lot of the immigrants, this is their first shower since they left their home country. And so it's a very welcome place for them to go. In the background there is the bags of clothing that they're given that they can change into after their shower. Now we're into the dining area. So this is where they serve 3 meals a day. The flags on the ceiling there indicate a lot of the different countries that the immigrants have come from. And they are served breakfast and lunch with, basic cereals and sandwiches and fruits. And then supper is Little Caesar's pizza every night. And the butterflies there are a symbol of the migration that the immigrants go through. And now Jane is going to come back and tell us a little bit about Frida and the healthcare aspect of things that goes on there.
Yeah, one other point, and one of the reasons Mark and I were interested in going down is to learn about kind of the health care that migrants receive when they first come across the border. In the lower right corner is Frida. She's the nurse in charge of their clinic. They have 2 rooms there where they can examine people. They have 3 CMAs that work all the time there. And then they have some residents from a local residency program that come in just a couple half days a week to help. And some of the things that they see, as you can imagine, people making a long journey, from Venezuela, places in South America or Central America. And of course, they have to cross through a very difficult jungle area and then across Mexico. And so a lot of people come with dehydration, so they have electrolyte solutions that they give people. A lot of wound care, so people have wounds that haven't healed or that are open. Also, I would say just like local infections, eye infections. There was one man there who had lost his eye. So just, and not to mention kind of the emotional trauma of all that too. So that's kind of something they address in the medical area as well. kind of the psychological trauma that people have faced. So that was pretty eye-opening to kind of hear about that. Okay, I don't know, Darlene, did you want to speak about Lupita? I think yeah.
I'm going to save that for next week, so I hope you'll return and also hear from the Maters about their experiences, just because we're short on time today and I need to speak about something else later on.
Okay, sounds good. So one of the great things about this experience is that we had the opportunity to share a meal and hear the stories of a couple of different immigrant women who came across the border for different reasons. Lupita was one of those women, and I'll let Darlene kind of give the longer story because it's an incredible story, but I think one of the things that just struck me about her story, she came because she was the oldest sister, and I believe, and she had some younger siblings that were not getting enough to eat, unable to attend school because the family was so poor. So she came across the border to work in the United States to send money back for her younger siblings, and she was basically enslaved. A family hired her, but then basically had her work for nothing, and basically told her, we'll basically turn you into authorities if you don't continue to work for us. So she was forced to work for that family. They wouldn't let her leave the home. And I think one of the things that we learned from this trip is how much human trafficking is really going on. How many people, because of their undocumented status, are being held, in these situations, and they can't do anything out of threat of being, turned into authorities. So, anyway, it's an amazing story, and Darlene will give us more details maybe next week. All right, moving on to Kirsten.
So Sunday, I think, was one of the most diverse days we had because of the variety of human experiences and then our experience in God's world, nature. We attended worship at Peace Lutheran, and you just heard a little bit about Peace Lutheran where in Las Cruces there, where we worshiped amidst a small congregation, a kind of aging congregation, but this was some beautiful stained glass windows there that we admired, and then the whole sacristy was beautiful carved natural wood that we admired as well, that really lended itself to our worship there. And this is where the Border Servant Corps began in terms of the people volunteering to host people coming across the border, and they saw that need and they rose up. The volunteers within that church rose up to meet that need. In that fellowship hall there, you see that's where they did all that work. Some parishioners within that congregation have purchased the guest house that we stayed in, and they continue to maintain it as well. So next we returned to our guest house, and we began our Gordita Making project under the direction of Carmen, that dear lady that you see there. There were many steps involved, from forming the dough to patting the circles, and then she fried them, and then we had to cut little slits in the dough and stuff them with vegetables and meat. And it was really a time of laughter and camaraderie among us, and everyone kind of found their niche in the process, and it was really delicious as well. Then we were seated around the group space after dinner. Oh, not the park yet. There we go. And we became absorbed in Carmen's story, her life story. She was living in Juarez across the border, which is sort of a twin city to El Paso, sort of like Minneapolis, St. Paul. It's just that close across the river. And she had a very good life surrounded with her family and friends, and her work. And in addition to her own 2 sons, she adopted 2 other children, an older boy, a teen, and then a younger girl, both who came into her life and made their way into her heart. The youngest was her daughter, a toddler with extreme medical needs, unaddressed spina bifida. And so this child required extensive medical care across the border. So she crossed over to find some medical help and told us about that through many emergency situations and surgeries, financial hardship and housing insecurity and whatnot. She explained how she experienced the intervention of angels. She spoke about that several times, and God's direction and power, not her own. She attributed it to the Lord's leading, and she found that help. And the immigration hurdles and paperwork and separation from her family over years, she eventually did secure her green card. And I think in hearing Carmen's story, we were really humbled, and that she shared, we were humbled by her vulnerability in sharing her story with us. We were thrilled then to be able to visit White Sands National Park on this day as well. And it's a 45-minute drive to the east of Las Cruces. It's the world's largest gypsum sand dune field. And we arrived late afternoon with about 45 minutes left to the park's closing. So we had an urgency to jump out of those vans and scurry across the dunes there to enjoy that area. We were really speechless in the uniqueness of this area, those ripples of sand and the sunlight against the rock formations in the background, and then we got to enjoy this beautiful, beautiful sunset. So that was quite a day. All right, on to Monday.
Monday was also a very important day for us, and I'm going to very quickly try to talk about our interesting visit with the U.S. Border Patrol. I found that to be a really interesting experience. In order to understand that, though, I have to tell you a little bit, we have to think about history. All across the southern border, what is now the southern border, once was Mexico. And that means that there were people that lived on both sides of that, what is now the border, and they have those ties that remain. As was said, El Paso and Juarez think of themselves as sister cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul. They still do. That's important for us to remember. Things did become part of the United States eventually, and until the middle of the next century, the border was very porous. People could go back and forth to visit family and friends and others. But you know what happened after World War II? The United States became the world's power, and that created a nation of a lot of prosperity next to a nation that's poverty, and that causes frictions that have been growing ever since the middle of the last century. The thing that's most important about history, though, is what happened because of 9/11. We don't think about that. But 9/11 was the first time in which our nation had been attacked from outside, and it caused us to have a great deal of fear and have enemies, and of course the natural reaction is to close the border. And that happened then at the border, our southern border. It was a big change that occurred because of that. And that leads us to the mission of the Border Patrol. The fellows that were a part of the Border Patrol, you could tell they had a great deal of pride in the fact that their number one mission is to keep us safe. And they do it very well. I hadn't thought much about that, but they do that very well, and we should be thankful for that. It's simply not true that thousands of people are pouring across the border every day. It's not true, because the Border Control keeps us safe, and we can be thankful for that. But there's another dimension that happens in all of that. Yes, the Border Patrol protects us from bad people, but most of the people that come to the border are not bad people. Most of the people that come to the border are simply desperate people. And it's the Border Patrol that first encounters these people. In talking with them, you could tell that they knew very well that many of the people that come to the border are victims. The Border Patrol are the ones that told us that before they cross Mexico, virtually every single one of these desperate people have been encountered by the cartels who have taken their money, sometimes taken their identification and all other things. They are basically robbed, and when they arrive at the border, they have virtually nothing. Now, you have to remember the Border Patrol, its mission is to keep us safe. And so even though they might have compassion for these people, and I think they do, they spoke of if someone is crossing the wall and they fall and break their leg, they take them to the hospital. They provide for their needs. But even if they have that compassion, they are bound by law to follow the laws of the United States. And that causes a great deal of trouble for them because the laws keep switching and keep changing. Not only just between administrations, but within them. And they're switching even right now to one thing or another. And that makes it very challenging for the Border Patrol people. So the Border Patrol are the face that first encounters these people as they come to the border. And they told us that as someone comes to a port of entry, they haven't broken any law. It's not against the law to come and ask for asylum or to even ask just to be allowed to come into the country. It's not breaking the law. They told us that many people will come to the border several times, so if you hear about a large number of people, 2.4 million is spoken of in fiscal year 2022, but they said many of these people come 10, 20, maybe more times. And so it's impossible to know exactly how many, but it's certainly less than half of that, and maybe it's only 400,000 or 500,000 people actually in the end of the day. The U.S. Border Patrol encounters these people in three ways. They come to a port of entry, which I got the impression from them is the usual way in which most of these people begin, at least to come. At a port of entry, they come and ask to enter the United States. If they ask for asylum, then they sometimes are given the privilege of going on to the next step, but we didn't hear this from the Border Patrol, but from other sources we came to the understanding that on the very day they present, about 80% of people immediately are sent back across the border. Second way in which the Border Patrol encounters people is those who cross illegally, and they apprehend them. It is a misdemeanor, like getting a parking ticket, but it also causes them problems along the way. They don't record the names of people that come to a port of entry and are sent back, but your name is recorded if you come across illegally in a crossing. And the third way, the most dangerous way, is that they come sometimes being trafficked by others. People are killed at the border, and most of those are people that have come across being trafficked. And someone else, I can say a little bit more about that. But the important thing for us to remember is that it's not illegal to come and ask for asylum. Unfortunately, asylum is defined very, very narrowly. To seek asylum, you have to be able to prove that you are in danger in your country that you lived in, or that if you are sent back, you will be in danger. Just being hungry is not grounds for asylum. Having starving children is not a ground for asylum, only that very narrow understanding. The Border Patrol folks told us that someone comes through the border, that 20% that kind of get to go on a little bit further, the very first thing that happens is an important thing. They are thoroughly vetted using the instruments of the United States, but also international vetting systems. And every single one of those people are vetted to decide whether they are a criminal or not. And if any criminal activity they're convicted of comes up, they're immediately deported from the United States. So I think it was one of the other people, either Ruben Garcia or someone at the Border Patrol, who said, I can guarantee you that there's not one criminal that comes through our system here. So they're vetted along the way, and what happens to them after that is they're either sent to a detention center. About 15% of the total people, or about 3/4 of those who come to the border, end up in detention centers. About 5% of them go to places like Border Servant Corps or Annunciation House, we're going to hear about in a minute. And those are the people that are put in contact, much like our congregation now is sponsoring someone. That's how that works. We were told that at the end of the day, only about 2% of people who ever present at the border are successful in staying in the United States. I came to have a deeper appreciation for the people at the Border Patrol. I think many of them are good people. They have a terribly tough job, and they are sworn to follow the laws, and so they do. And so it's a really complicated situation that we face. For me, I think it's important that we ground our thoughts into our faith tradition, and I want to share, just as I close, briefly 3 Bible stories that have meaning to me. The first of those Bible stories is Luke's parable in the Gospel of Luke, the 16th chapter, when he talks about the rich man dressed in clothing who has a man named Lazarus who lies at his gate. I know that I'm the rich man, and I know that my country is the rich man in the story. And so the question is, do we see Lazarus lying at our gate? For me, this adventure of going down there helped me to see Lazarus more clearly. The second Bible passage that I want to share is about Jesus meeting the Canaanite woman in the Gospel of Mark. And she is an outsider, and she's begging that Jesus would heal her daughter. And Jesus' first words to her, "It's not right to give the children's bread to the dogs." And she says, "Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the table." And the question for me is whether or not we are a country that will let the rest of the world eat our crumbs. We are the most blessed country on earth, the most powerful, the most prosperous. And the third story is from the Gospel of Matthew, the 25th chapter, where Jesus says, "I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was naked and you clothed me." And they say, "Well, when did we see you?" And Jesus said, "As you did it to the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me." I think Jesus comes and stands at the U.S. border every day and looks across. And the question we need to ponder is, how are we going to treat that Jesus? And now I think I hand it off to Bo.
Thank you, Gene. All right, so I'm going to kind of continue our story about Monday. We eat a lot of Mexican food on this trip. I was kind of done with tortillas, but by the end. But one of the places we got to visit was this Cafe Mayapan, which is kind of a neat story, very different than the border immigrant experience. This is a community center, and it's really a training center. Particularly, it came to the fruition after NAFTA was passed, because what happened is you had a lot of Mexican migrants that would come over to work, and many of these factories were in the U.S., and after that, you might know a lot of those jobs went away. And so they found they often had a lot of single-parent households and people that were not earning a living and needed to find out a way how they could learn to master a job. So we actually ate at this restaurant that was all trainees, people learning how to run a restaurant themselves, how to cook and operate retail operations. They also had a textile crafting and things like that to really help people learn valuable skills. So that was a really neat experience that we had there. So this was, for me, one of the most powerful experiences. We got to visit, it's called Annunciation House. And this is a volunteer organization that's rooted in Catholic social teaching, and it offers hospitality to immigrants, migrants, and refugees. And as you can guess, mostly from Mexico and Central America. And they have 4 sites, and it's kind of similar to Board and Servant Corps, where they're welcoming and providing hospitality to people that have just come over the border. They've been in operation 45 years, and they're led by this gentleman, Ruben Garcia, who's quite well known. In fact, when President Biden made his trip recently to the border, he actually met with Mr. Garcia. So it was very powerful to hear his words. I don't know if any of you have met or seen Mary Jo Copeland in Minneapolis, but he really reminded me of her, just that deep conviction and that compassion for serving the poorest of the poor, very, very much his mission. Our experience was interesting because when we arrived at this location, it doesn't really look, it's an old convent, but it was very secure, windows barred, and we had to wait outside for some time because they were really scurrying around. They are constantly on their phones texting these agencies saying, can you take these people, can you take these people? So there's quite a bit of commotion. So once we did get in, we got to meet some of the people that were working there, and it was pretty powerful what Reuben said, because people are coming across the border for the same reasons they've been coming for decades. It's safety, it's their ability to feed their children, it is avoiding physical danger, and it's just they're in many cases unable to meet human needs. So we found that really powerful. And one thing that Reuben took us through this exercise where he asked us all to close our eyes. And he said, imagine how bad would it have to get for you in the United States of America to flee your home country? What would you experience? What would you be fearing? What would you be feeling? And we all realized that it was really hard for us as North Americans to get our heads around that concept. We so take for granted our security, our way of life, our safety, that I think his point was that it's kind of difficult in many cases to be empathetic with our neighbors across the border. So that was a really powerful experience, and for me, just changed my perspective in many ways. So the key mission for Annunciation House is to, like Border Servant Corps, get these refugees and immigrants to sponsors. And what they would love to be able to do is send busloads of people, particularly up north, where they would be welcomed. They do that, but in many cases they're going to large urban populations and they're just sent to homeless shelters. They would love to have more people like our community, churches in particular, families, that would welcome them. You know, for example, the biggest country right now is Venezuela, where they're dealing with just such chaos and instability. And those people, as it turns out, have the fewest number of sponsors. So they really come here and they just don't know a soul. There's nobody to welcome them. So he is desperate to find communities, churches, organizations that would welcome these people. And that was a big takeaway that we had from that experience. So we asked Reuben, before I get to that, somebody asked, how do you keep going? Because this problem has not gotten any better. In many ways, it's gotten worse. And he said, what really keeps me passionate about what we're doing is that when these people come off this bus, it's the first time they're going from a detention capacity to a hospitality capacity. They all gather in the same sanctuary where we met. And he said, I get to tell them, you are in the church, you are safe. And it's the first time they've heard those words. And he said, when you see the weight come off their shoulders and their faces, that is so powerful. And he said that's what keeps them going. So the last question we asked him was about immigration reform, right? So we haven't had anything close to meaningful legislation going back to the George Bush days. And he kind of shrugged off the politics of it. I think he just felt like that is somewhat impossible, and that it really is more of a social issue. But he said what we really need is a majority of North Americans to be outraged that our neighbors are so horribly treated in many cases by their own governments or these cartels or fellow citizens, and they're so oppressed. And basically we need to acknowledge our fundamental interconnectedness to each other. That if we could get to that place, I think a lot of our immigration policy would naturally change. So it was very, very powerful. We did ask, what about this Title 42, which you might have heard of? It's a public health policy. It was enacted with COVID, and it's still in place. Basically, there's 5 countries where people just can't come in, or they're rejected from the border because of this public health policy. And we all assumed he would say he'd hoped that it would be repealed, but he actually said it's actually not what he wants. Because as soon as that happens, it would really, from a political standpoint, arm anti-immigration people and really, I think, hurt their progress. So it was a very powerful conversation that we got to have with Reuben. And we did get to go, shifting gears here, as we noticed that you can literally see this dividing line, El Paso here, and where that red X is Juarez. These are two cities really so closely connected, and the wall is just so visible as you look up from this. We're on the Rim Road looking down. There's Fletcher, and that's facing the Juarez side. And it was just such a stark contrast, particularly these residential areas, where, as Jean mentioned, just the contrast of absolute prosperity and what was really pretty much extreme poverty. So. All right, Mari.
Okay, we need to wrap up very soon, so I'm going to talk about Tuesday in about 1 minute. And that's okay, because Tuesday was actually a day with a lot of synthesis for us of things we had been learning about and talking about earlier in our trip. So the part that was different, though, is we spent the morning, in the district court. And it was a wonderful opportunity to see how these things are playing out in our legal system, which quite honestly was very overwhelming for us to take in. That morning, all of the cases we heard were pre-trial cases. So we weren't actually seeing a case play out to completion, but we were so impressed with the judge and with his listening, with his commitment to making sure all the defendants understood what was being asked and what would come next. And afterward, he came and spoke with us individually, and we were able to ask more questions. He told some other stories about things that are happening, things that are, in some ways unimaginable. We've had these people cross the border, and they've been essentially imprisoned in a home held by cartel members for ransom. And so until more money was paid, they couldn't even get out of this house. And we had an individual that was able to get out of that house and seek help from authorities. And so those people are now going to be coming before his courtroom. But that's happening more and more, and we learned about that and more from him that day. And then, just really briefly, then we had lunch downtown at a fun restaurant called Mateo's, which featured the carne asada fries, which many had, including, I know, Marie. Then we had a little break. We had a couple of hours of free time, which was really needed because these are really big topics, as you've been hearing about, and it was nice to spend a couple of hours outside hiking and enjoying the outdoors. And then we came back and we stopped at a place called Old Mesilla, which is a really beautiful, picturesque village that is just south of Las Cruces and looks pretty much the same as it did 100 years ago, only now it's housing art galleries, museums, and some shopping. The main point here, New Mexico is known for pecans. We saw lots of pecan trees. In fact, chocolate-covered pecans were a featured element in the Sunday morning service at Peace Lutheran. So we stopped and got chocolate-covered pecans at Old Mesilla, and then we came back and heard our final speaker of our trip, which was someone who was talking with us from the ACLU. And again, I'm not going to go over this because Gene covered quite a bit of this in his talk, but it did focus a little bit more on the ICE aspect than what we'd been seeing, which is more from the Border Patrol. And he shared some stories about Border Patrol which were not quite as positive as the ones we heard from Border Patrol themselves. And we also were a little surprised to find out that the detention centers are run by for-profit companies, which I guess we didn't anticipate or think about. There are a lot of people profiting from what is happening at the border. And so it really left us wondering, and we still are, but we've learned a lot more, how can we help this situation?
Darlene, you want to say something before we wrap up? Okay, thank you.
Very quickly. On this handout, you'll notice there's a date where this needs to be done by March 27th, which is a week from tomorrow. We just became aware of this, but the Biden administration is proposing some changes to the asylum situation, and it's not good. So if you could please go to the LIRS, which is Lutheran Immigration Refugee Service, and read that article that's on that very first page, and then find the link. On the handout is a copy of the letter that they ask you to revise or personalize or just completely make up your own to protest what the Biden administration is doing. They are open for comments until March 27th. But if this, not legislation, but if this proposal goes into effect, it would virtually keep out people like the family we are now sponsoring. People who come through other countries and don't stop and apply for asylum there would be kept out of applying for asylum here. There's more in that letter it's too lengthy to explain now. So please take the time to read through this, and this is just one action that you can take. And next week we hope to talk about more of those things. So thank you.
Thanks, Darlene. All right, so just to wrap up, yeah, there are things that we can do. We all kind of felt overwhelmed from everything we learned, but we also realized there are things that can help. One of the things that we're doing here at Bethel is sponsoring a family that came across the border. Our family, many of you have met the Ramirez family. Lizbeth is the mom, and the son Ander with Anna Lee there. Anna Lee made the talk, and Keyshia. Keishia's 11, Ander is 2. This family actually came through Border Servant Corps where we visited, and normally families stay for 2 to 3 days. They were there for 21 days, eating pizza every night, and they will not eat pizza now. But basically they had nowhere to go. They didn't have any family in the United States. So we received a call, the ELCA received a call asking a church to sponsor them because otherwise they were going to be sent on a bus to a homeless shelter in New York City, which, as you know, many buses are going to cities with families like this. And you can imagine having nothing on your back, no money, no food. You do not speak a word of the language, and you're dropped off at a homeless shelter in New York City. It's really overwhelming. In fact, our daughter Jessie's in Denver right now working at a homeless shelter, and this is happening in Denver every day. So it's, so it's a blessing that we were able to say yes, and it's been an awesome experience, but it takes a lot of resources. And so one of the ways that you can help us is to sponsor or make a donation to sponsor our family. Make a donation to Bethel, and Rose has envelopes in the back. It's our Easter offering this year. We'll go to the family, but you can certainly just send a check with refugee fund in the byline, and that would be really helpful to us. Housing and food and all those things. Asylum seekers cannot work for 150 days from when they actually get their asylum paperwork filed, and that even takes time. So people have no source of income for at least 6 months that they're here. So that's difficult. As you can see, Border Servant Corps and Annunciation House are both excellent organizations. We can absolutely attest to that. So if you want to make a donation to people doing work at the border, we would recommend either of those organizations. And then 2 organizations that have been super helpful to us, even with the Ramirez family, Health Finders here and in Faribault, because health insurance is not something that can be gotten by non-citizens, and the Northfield Community Action Center has been key for helping us with housing, food, etc. So those would be places you could go if you wanted to help out. So, all right, well, I think church is starting at 10:45, so we'd welcome you to come back next week for a little more information and more time for questions and discussion. So thank you so much for being here.